bring in Sky News contributor Kosha Gada. Now, Kosha, Victorians are fed up with their state police force, with public confidence in Victoria Police falling to its lowest levels since records began. Just 58% of those surveyed said they were satisfied with policing service, with the same number saying they have confidence in the police. Victoria Police really want those numbers to be in the 80s, not in the 50s. We're a long way from that, former Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Kel Blair said. Unfortunately, what we saw through COVID and the lockdowns was many police actions being unreasonable, violent and indefensible. Victoria Police was seen as tools of the government, not independent, and that cost them dearly. And Kosha, in recent weeks, we've seen judgments to that effect from a judge in a courtroom saying police were the instigators of violent clashes, used unreasonable force. We can kind of understand these figures.
Indeed, I think this is one of many consequences on the long bow of consequences from the fiasco that was the way governments conducted themselves around the world. In COVID, you saw Fauci hearings in the US, different but related all these years later, and the anger is very palpable among people. So the police were not policy makers, but they were policy enforcers. They did misuse discretion in terms of how to bring their force to bear. And I think it's not a surprise that those results are there. There's a second undercurrent too, which I think is the politicization of all institutions, including the police force. And that's another piece to that people don't trust institutions. There's a crisis of credibility, and there is a loss of this trust in terms of how well they're executing themselves and exercising their force, and that's part of this as well.
Absolutely, and we saw some of those indefensible actions just before with some of that vision that was on screen. We cannot forget that, and there really hasn't been a reckoning for most of that. I know there's a lawsuit happening now from 5 people who were arrested violently, but there were so many others who were affected in a fairly dramatic fashion. Now let's talk about Liberal MP Bridget Archer signing a letter to the PM along with more than a dozen crossbenchers backing the International Criminal Court's pursuit of Israel. The letter warned against efforts to undermine the independence and the impartiality of the ICC. That's incredible. The ICC is neither impartial or independent in any meaningful sense, and I will be speaking to Douglas Murray about that very shortly. But Kosha, these few remaining bedwetters within the Liberal Party are doing enormous damage. The reason why it took the Liberal Party 10 months to come out against The Voice, 10 months because of this tiny number. And Bridget Archer, I mean, she should just go and join the Teals and see if she can get elected.
Indeed. I think the problem both parties have, but certainly the Liberal Party, is when we live in this world of a little bit of the coalition of different fringe ideas, where there's maybe 70-80% in common with the Liberal Party, but there is that 20 to 30% that isn't, that becomes a very difficult coalition to govern. And so opposition leader has his hands full with doing that. He should exercise any consequences that he may, or any mechanisms he may have to show leadership within that. I think another thing too, though, is to show more higher contrast positions on the 80% where most of these folks do agree and their constituents agree: immigration, free speech, energy, the economy, and coloring in bold colors and not pastels on those issues to really show contrast against the other side of the aisle might help corral the party in favor of what their constituents want to see, and showing more contrast as opposed to getting mired in these few areas where there's this issue and this lack of consensus.
Now, the Herald Sun reveals the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, is failing some of our most vulnerable with an intellectually disabled boy. This example is incredible. This poor kid has experienced more than 500 critical incidents, 5 near-death experiences in less than 2 years because of these catastrophic failures. And Kosha, taxpayers are forking out $2 million a year just for this one child's NDIS program. This scheme is not only being rorted, being misused, but it is unsustainable. How can we afford this?
We can't. On a human level, it's such a heartbreaking story, but it's yet another example of government bloat and government overreach, and as Maggie Thatcher said, eventually you run out of other people's money. So it is not sustainable, and this is just another infrastructure out there that's relying on taxpayer money. Government bodies are never efficient at how they operate, so it's no surprise. It's only going to have more stress on the system with immigration, which is the issue of our time, and more of that is going to be brought to bear on all institutions, including the NDIS. And I would also make a broader point that it's a little bit of an indictment on society for many reasons, that so much care is outsourced to these government institutions, whether it's aged care or disability care.
Yeah.
There are reasons for it, economic reasons and others, but it is something about our society, I think, that's getting us to this point where we outsource the difficult parts of life to these organizations that are just never going to be run efficiently, and that's why you see scenarios like this popping up.
It is a greater societal ill, isn't it, that families are reluctant to, and you said there's economic reasons for it, there's all sorts of reasons for it, but yeah, I think there is a broader issue there. Now let's talk about the US, and the Wall Street Journal is perhaps stating the obvious here in a feature piece called "Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping." In a well-researched piece, the Wall Street Journal interviewed 45 insiders close to the president, both Republicans and Democrats, who said when President Biden met with congressional leaders in the West Wing in January to negotiate a Ukraine funding deal, he read from notes to make obvious points, paused for extended periods, and sometimes closed his eyes for so long that some in the room wondered whether he had tuned out. And I wonder what, fallen asleep. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy told the Wall Street Journal, "I used to meet with him when he was Vice President. I'd go to his house. He's not the same person. He would ramble. He always had cards. He couldn't negotiate another way. He was going back to all the old stuff that had been done for a long time. And he was shocked when I'd say, 'No, Mr. President, we talked about that meetings ago. We are done with that.'" Kosha, I don't think anyone is too shocked by this other than rusted on Democrats. His decline is obvious. It's not just behind closed doors. I could play clips nightly on this program, and the change in him, even from 4 years ago, is dramatic.
It really is, and anybody who's had an aging relative that goes through that knows it is not linear, and the change month to month can accelerate and be much more than it was even a year ago. Some tell us, don't believe your lying eyes, just believe what the reports are that massage that, but the whole world can see this. And the thing with journalism historically is I always think of it where there were two phases to it. One is discovery and investigation, and then one is shaping and influencing public opinion. And we could argue that the latter has become more what journalism is about these days compared to the former. So to me, that was interesting in this, not so much the report, but why. Why now is more and more of the media coming out and shaping public opinion or providing cover for something, and everybody thinks, is it going to be that switcheroo at the August convention or not?
Well, if it's coming, it's not too far away. It's going to be, we won't get into that because the same names come up over and over again. We're just going to have to wait and see. Now, as if convicting Donald Trump in a sham trial wasn't enough for the left, The Guardian are now asking the question, what does Trump have in common with Adolf Hitler? No, really, this isn't a parody site. This is The Guardian, some would argue. It is a parody site. And they quote Henk de Burgh, a professor of German at the University of Sheffield in Britain, who said, "I looked at their rhetorical strategies and their public relations operations, and I began to see how similar they are in many ways." It's like it's 2015-16 all over again, Kosha. Of course, The Guardian repeats a number of lies as facts, including the thoroughly debunked "very fine people on both sides" lie. Kosha, do we just laugh at this? Is this just another case of lefties losing it? Or should we be concerned about the dangerous disinformation that this represents and the fact that there is a sizable percentage of Americans who think democracy will die if Trump is re-elected?
I think it's both. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's so 2015, that old chestnut of equating Hitler to Trump. We're back at it again. I do think the potency of that comparison has diminished, and the swath of people who feel that is shrinking, but it is still quite significant, and therefore we should worry when this kind of rhetoric is, put out there, even though obviously they have the right to do that. The other thing that I find interesting, just as an American, there are so many people, because I think he's Dutch, if I remember that correctly. He's a professor of German at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And there's so many people, foreigners, who are so emotionally invested in discussing the former president, or even when he was currently president. And, I get it. The US has outsized influence on all countries in the world. I understand that. But the level of emotional investment in this thing, I just always find a little bit amusing. Holland has a lot of issues, and maybe this Dutch professor might be well advised to focus on his own country's issues instead of always talking about Trump.
And to have those sorts of thoughts perhaps in 2016, okay, you were stupid, but now it's inexcusable because they had 4 years of him in power. And if you are an international observer, his foreign policy positions and policies were really much sounder than what we have seen in the last 3.5 years. So how you could see him as some sort of a Hitler is beyond me. Kosha Gada, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.